The rain fell on Berlin not as a blessing, but as a frozen curse. It was one of those late autumn rains that promised to turn to snow at any moment, and each drop that hit the window of Frau Schmidt's small apartment sounded like a stamp of rejection. Outside, huddled under the awning of a closed bakery, was Aya. Her thin body, wrapped in a thin coat unsuitable for that European climate, trembled almost uncontrollably. In her arms, nestled against her chest in a desperate effort for warmth, slept little Yusef, just 3 years old. Aya's face, marked by a Mediterranean beauty that the months of hardship stubbornly tried to erase, was a study in silent resignation. Her brown eyes, once full of the fire of the Mediterranean Sea, were now opaque, fixed on the puddle of water forming at her feet. Each passing car, splashing dirty water to the side, made her flinch, protecting her son with her own body. The escape from Tunisia had been a nightmare, a succession of dark nights in the holds of boats and endless days of walking. The violence of the man she had fled, a nightmare she carried in scars no one could see, echoed inside her louder than any thunder. Now here in the promise of safety of Europe, she found herself alone, without documents, without a roof over her head, and with the constant fear that someone would take away the only thing she had left, her son. Silence was her only defense. To speak meant to attract attention. To attract attention meant danger. So she took refuge in silence, becoming a shadow, a specter on the edge of society. Yusef mumbled in his sleep, and his small, pale lips moved, murmuring a word in Arabic. "Mother." That whisper, almost muffled by the sound of the rain, was the arrow that pierced Aya's hardened heart. She couldn't give up. Not for herself but for him. The darkness of the night deepened, and the cold was beginning to be not just a discomfort, but a real threat. It was then that the door of the building opposite her opened, and an elderly woman, with an austere face and hair tied in a strict bun, appeared. Frau Schmidt. She looked at the scene with an impenetrable expression, her clear blue eyes examining the drenched woman and the child. Aya lowered her eyes, bracing herself for a reprimand, for being sent away. But the voice that came was firm, without warmth, but also without hostility. "You'll freeze the child to death out here," the woman said, in perfect German that Aya could barely understand. But the gesture was universal. Frau Schmidt opened the door a little wider. An invitation. A risk. Aya's heart raced, a tumult of fear and hope. That silence she had cultivated so much was about to be broken. She took a step forward, feeling the weight of the unknown, but the greater weight of her love for her son pushed her into the warm light emanating from the hall. Frau Schmidt's apartment was a sanctuary of absolute order and sepulchral silence. Each piece of darkwood furniture seemed to occupy a position designated by divine decree, and the air smelled of beeswax and a faint aroma of potato soup, a scent that for Aya was both strangely comforting and profoundly oppressive. She stood on the doormat, dripping water onto the immaculately clean floor, feeling more out of place than ever. The landlady, without saying a word, pointed to a small bathroom at the end of the hallway. The gesture was clear. Aya entered, carrying Yusef, who was now awake and looking around with wide, frightened eyes. The hot shower was an almost painful experience. The warm water on his cold, callous skin made her realize the depth of her exhaustion. As she washed the dirt and sweat from Yusef's face, watching his small body relax for the first time in weeks, a solitary tear finally escaped her eye, mingling with the shower water. It was a tear of relief, of gratitude, but also of acute fear. What did this quiet, stern woman want in return? Nothing in life was free, she had learned the hard way. As they left, wrapped in clean, soft towels, they found 2 bowls of hot soup on the kitchen table. Frau Schmidt was no longer in the room. "Eat," was all she said, her voice echoing from the other room. Aya sat Yusef in a chair, and they ate as if it were the first and last meal in the world. Each spoonful of soup was a balm, a warmth that spread from stomach to soul. While Yusef fell into a deep sleep on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket Frau Schmidt had brought, Aya got up and began to clean. Not out of obligation, but out of a primal impulse of gratitude. She washed the bowls, dried them meticulously, and put them away in the cupboard. She cleaned the sink until it was sparkling. She tidied the towels in the bathroom. Each action was a silent payment, an attempt to balance the debt she felt she had incurred. Frau Schmidt watched from afar, from the doorway of the room, her arms crossed. She didn't smile, didn't approve, nor disapprove. She simply observed. The expression in her eyes was difficult to read, but it wasn't cruel. There was a curiosity there, an interest that went beyond mere charity. She saw the dignity with which Aya performed those small tasks, the furtive elegance in her movements, despite the desperate situation. Night had completely fallen. Frau Schmidt, without ceremony, pointed to a small guest room, simple but clean. "You can stay here tonight," she said, and then retired to her own room. Aya lay down beside Youssef on the narrow bed, listening to his regular, peaceful breathing. For the first time in months, she was under a roof, warm and safe. But the silence of the apartment was different from the silence of the streets. It was a silence heavy with history, with contained memories, and she felt, with a deep intuition, that she had awakened something in that woman. Something that had been dormant for a long time. Something that, for her good or for her ill, was now alive. The following morning arrived with the pale winter light filtering through the slats of the blinds. For Aya, it was strange to wake up without the sounds of the city, without the penetrating cold in her bones. Youssef was still asleep, a deep and restorative sleep that made her heart clench with love. The apartment was still silent, but a smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. It was a smell that spoke of normalcy, of a life she had thought she had lost forever. She left the room cautiously, finding the kitchen table set for one. Frau Schmidt was seated, reading a newspaper, her coffee cup perfectly centered on the saucer. She didn't even look up when Aya entered. "There's bread in the pantry," he said dryly. Aya understood the tone. This wasn't a long-term stay. It was a respite, a single act of mercy that was now coming to an end. The knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach again. Where would they go? What would they do? While Youssef ate a piece of bread and butter, happy and oblivious to the precariousness of his situation, Aya made up her mind. She couldn't simply leave. She had to prove her worth, her willingness to work. With Youssef's hand securely held, she approached Frau Schmidt, who was now washing dishes in the sink. "Madam," Aya said in hesitant, broken German, the result of a few weeks of poor study in a shelter. "I work. Cleaning. Cooking. Please. I'll do anything." Frau Schmidt stopped and observed her. Her eyes seemed to search Aya's soul, weighing her character. The silence lingered, so dense it seemed tangible. "I don't need help," she finally replied. But then, her gaze fell on Youssef, who held the hem of Aya's dress, his large, dark eyes filled with an innocent trust in his mother. Something in that scene, in the vulnerability and strength represented in those two figures, seemed to soften a fraction of her resistance. She sighed, a sound almost imperceptible. "The attic," she said, pointing upwards. "It's full of old junk, decades of dust. It's dirty work. If you want—" Aya didn't let her finish. Yes, thank you." The gratitude in her voice was so intense it almost choked her. The attic was her lifeline, her chance to extend her stay for a few more hours, maybe even another day. As she climbed the narrow stairs, with Youssef quietly playing in a corner of the room with some wooden blocks that Frau Schmidt had unexpectedly brought from somewhere, Aya felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't begging. You were offering your labor. There was a dignity in that, a thread of her former self that she could grasp. And unknowingly, by accepting the task, she wasn't just cleaning an attic. She was opening the door to a past that Frau Schmidt had kept locked away for years. The attic stairs creaked beneath her feet, a groan of protest against the intrusion. The door jammed before giving way, revealing a dense darkness and a stifling smell of time standing still and aged wood. When Aya turned on the dim light, a single bulb hanging by a wire, she held her breath. The attic was a time capsule from the last century. Furniture draped in white sheets and dust resembled sleeping ghosts. Piles of cardboard boxes, withered by dampness, piled up to the ceiling. There was an old wooden crib, a rocking horse with peeling paint, and in the corner, a heavy, ornate trunk that seemed to hold secrets. The air was cold and heavy, laden not only with dust but with the weight of unreachable memories. For Aya, however, this chaos was a blank canvas. It was an opportunity. She rolled up the sleeves of the old dress Frau Schmidt had given her and began to work. Methodically, with a patience forged in adversity, she began to clean. First, sweeping away cobwebs and the surface layer of dust. Then, wiping each piece of furniture with a damp cloth, revealing the beauty of the dark wood beneath decades of neglect. She didn't touch the boxes, respecting the privacy of that house. Her focus was on cleaning, on restoring order. As she worked, her mind wandered. She thought of her own mother, of her home in Tunisia, full of life, the smells of spices and laughter. She remembered the day she met Yusef's father, the initial sweetness that turned into control, and then violence. She remembered the constant fear, the risky escape, the terrible sea crossing in an overcrowded boat. Each memory was a stab, but the physical work, the act of transforming that neglected space, was a form of therapy. She was, in a way, cleansing her own soul. While cleaning a high shelf, her hand touched an object behind a pile of old books. It was a picture frame. She pulled it down, wiping the dusty glass with the hem of her dress. The photo was of a young woman with corn-blonde hair, smiling radiantly with a baby in her arms. Beside her, a tall man in military uniform gazed at her with absolute devotion. Aya recognized Frau Schmidt's clear, austere eyes in that happy young woman. The baby, she didn't know. What had happened to that family? What had transformed that radiant woman into the closed-off silent person she was now? Placing the photo back in its place with solemn respect, Aya felt a wave of empathy for her hostess. She too carried her own sorrows. Perhaps they were different in form, but not in intensity. The work continued, and when the last corner was swept and the furniture gleamed with a soft glow, the attic no longer seemed like a ghost warehouse, but a space brimming with potential. Aya went down, dirty, tired, but with a sense of accomplishment. Frau Schmidt went up to inspect. She stood at the top of the stairs, her face impassive. Her eyes scanned every inch of the attic, from the clean wood to the swept floor. There were no compliments, no smiles. But there was a small, almost imperceptible nod. And in her eyes for the first time, Aya saw something beyond curiosity or cold courtesy. She saw the moist gleam of a deeply contained emotion, a visual sigh of something stirring, painfully, after a long period of slumber. Frau Schmidt's nod was the greatest reward Aya could have imagined. There were no words, but the silence that followed was different. It was a silence of acceptance, perhaps even respect. The landlady came down from the attic and, without looking back, said, "The bath is free. There are clean clothes for the child on the bed." It was more than Aya had hoped for. Another night. Another day of security. As she bathed Yusef, she hummed a Tunisian lullaby, her voice, hoarse from disuse, regaining a long-lost sweetness. Yusef laughed, a sound that was pure music to Aya's ears. That night, the soup on the table came with a piece of sausage and fresh bread. A feast. Frau Schmidt even put out an extra plate of boiled potatoes for Yusef, who devoured them with his hands, making the old lady observe with an expression that was not one of disapproval, but something akin to scientific curiosity. Aya felt a tenuous bridge, made not of words but of silent gestures, being built between them. The next day, unasked, Aya rose at dawn. While Frau Schmidt was still asleep, she went to the kitchen. The memory of her grandmother teaching her the secrets of Tunisian cooking surfaced with painful clarity. With the basic ingredients she found, flour, eggs, a little sugar, lemons, she began to work. It wasn't an act of rebellion, but of pure gratitude. A gratitude that her German words couldn't express. Her hands, calloused by life, kneaded the dough with surprising tenderness. She was making makraut, a traditional semolina pastry filled with dates and fried, then dipped in a honey and lemon syrup. It was the taste of her home, of her childhood, of celebrations. It was the only truly valuable thing she could offer. The sweet, citrusy fragrance began to fill the apartment, a foreign and exotic invader in that controlled atmosphere. Frau Schmidt appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing her dressing gown, her face showing genuine surprise for the first time. She said nothing, only watched Aya work, her nimble hands shaping the sweets into diamond shapes, her concentration absolute. There was an art to it, a tradition that transcended language. When the first batch was golden and crisp, Aya placed one on a small plate and offered it to Frau Schmidt. Her eyes were lowered, a sign of respect, but her heart pounded. It was a test. The landlady took the sweet, examined it for a moment, and took a small bite. The flavor was intense, sweet, but not excessively so, with the acidity of the lemon and the earthy richness of the dates. A complexity of flavors that German food, in its simplicity, did not possess. Frau Schmidt did not smile. But her eyes closed for a brief instant, and when they opened, there was a different gleam in them. "Interesting," was all she said, before turning her back and leaving the kitchen. But she didn't reject it. She ate all the mackerel. For Aya, it was a monumental victory. She hadn't given an object, but a piece of her soul, of her culture. And that piece, apparently, wasn't rejected. Later, she noticed that Frau Schmidt had left an old woolen coat on the sofa, a warm and practical coat, obviously meant for her. Aya's act of kindness, silent and full of meaning, echoed and returned as a silent gift. The debt was being paid not in money, but in humanity. The fragile bubble of peace that Aya had built shattered the following morning, with the shrill ringing of the doorbell. The sound was like a gunshot, making Yusef jump in fright and cling to his mother's leg. Through the peephole, Frau Schmidt saw two men. One in an authoritative uniform with a bureaucratic and impersonal expression, and the other, a neighbor from the building, Herr Schneider, whose face was a mask of disdain and intrusion. The blood seemed to freeze in Aya's veins. She didn't need to understand the words to know what it meant. Immigration. Police. Deportation. Frau Schmidt, for a moment, seemed to hesitate. Her gaze fell on Aya, who was pale as a ghost, visibly trembling, trying to make herself small behind the living room door. The image of that frightened woman, protecting her son, must have collided with some deep memory, with some long-buried principle. She opened the door, but only a crack. "Yes." Her voice was icy, sharp as a blade. The officer explained that they had received an anonymous tip about an illegal immigrant residing at the location. Herr Schneider, behind him, tried to peer into the apartment, his face filled with self-righteous and petty prejudice. Frau Schmidt didn't move. Her thin body stiffened, blocking the entrance. "There's no one here but me," she said, her voice firm and clear. "The person you sheltered last week, the woman with the child. We saw them," insisted Herr Schneider, his voice high-pitched. Frau Schmidt looked at him with such deep contempt that the man took a step back. "You're seeing things, Herr Schneider," she replied, each word a block of ice. "Or you're making it up. My private life is none of your business. Now, if you don't mind, I have things to do." The officer, looking somewhat embarrassed by the woman's coldness and the lack of concrete evidence, murmured an apology and turned to leave. Herr Schneider paused for a moment, flushed with anger, before following the officer, muttering. Frau Schmidt closed the door with a soft but decisive click. She turned and faced Aya. The fear in the Tunisian woman's eyes was a living, palpable thing. Will they come back?" Aya whispered, her voice trembling. Frau Schmidt watched her for a long moment. The forbidden interest she had felt, a mixture of curiosity, silent loneliness, and perhaps the echo of a long-denied maternal instinct, solidified at that moment into something more concrete, a decision. "No," she said simply. "Not while they are under my roof." In that short sentence, Aya heard not only a promise of protection, but the sound of chains breaking. Frau Schmidt, for the first time in decades, was choosing a side. And she was choosing theirs. The outside world, with its cruel rules and hostility, had knocked on her door, and she had closed it. Aya, speechless, bowed her head in a gesture of profound, immeasurable gratitude. She was no longer just a refugee. She was, in a way, an assumed responsibility. The days that followed the confrontation with authority marked a subtle, but fundamental shift in the apartment's dynamic. The icy barrier surrounding Frau Schmidt didn't melt, but cracks developed through which light could enter. She began leaving the newspaper on the table after reading it, a tacit invitation for Aya, with her battered German dictionary, to try and decipher the words. One afternoon, she placed an old sewing machine on the living room table and pointed to a tear in Aya's dress. A practical gesture, not a gift, but an invitation to mend, to become self-sufficient within that microcosm. Aya accepted with fervent gratitude. As she patiently relearned to sew, a skill her mother had taught her, Frau Schmidt observed, sometimes making a dry comment about the technique. It was her way of connecting. One night, while the television was showing images of a refugee camp somewhere in Europe, a report full of statistics and anonymous faces, Youssef, playing on the floor, pointed at the screen and said, "Home?" The word, laden with innocent confusion, hung in the air. Frau Schmidt, who was knitting, stopped. Her fingers, nimble with the needles, remained still. She looked at Youssef, then at Aya, whose face was marked by resigned pain. "Where, exactly, do you come from?" Frau Schmidt asked, her voice softer than usual. Aya looked up, surprised. It was the first real personal question. She took a deep breath and, in broken German, interspersed with French words and sometimes Arabic when vocabulary failed her, began to tell her story. She spoke of the blue sea of Sidi Bou Said, of the white and blue streets, of the scent of jasmine at night. And then she spoke of the man who had become her husband, of the gradual shift from love to control, to violent jealousy, to the blows she endured until the day he raised his hand to Youssef. That was when she knew she had to leave. She described the terrifying journey, the constant fear, the hunger, the feeling of being a ghost, unwanted everywhere. She didn't cry. Her voice was a harsh whisper, a factual narrative of hell. When she finished, the silence in the room was heavy and sacred. Frau Schmidt didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at the fake flames of the electric heater. Then she spoke, her voice so low that Aya could barely hear. "I also lost someone," she said. "My husband. My young son. A car accident, in the winter of 1978. The ice on the road." She had never said those words to anyone. They came out like a relic from an open grave. Aya understood then the origin of that silence, that coldness. Frau Schmidt was not merely an austere woman. She was a ruin, preserved within her own suffering. The forbidden interest Aya had aroused was not romantic, but human. It was the echo of a lost motherhood, of an interrupted life, seeing itself reflected in the mirror of another interrupted life. That night, the two women, separated by age, culture and history, sat in a shared silence, united by the universal language of loss. A week passed. The apartment's routine had settled in. Aya took care of the household chores with a zeal that made the house brighter than ever. Youssef filled the hallways with his babbling laughter, and Frau Schmidt observed, silently participating in this strange new family dynamic. Aya knew, however, that this was temporary. She couldn't hide forever. The threat of the outside world was still there. It was then that Frau Schmidt did something extraordinary. One afternoon, she went out for a few hours and returned with a folder of documents and an expression of resolute determination. "We need to regularize your situation," she announced, placing the folder on the kitchen table like a general presenting a battle plan. Inside were asylum application forms, papers that needed to be filled out, a list of specialized immigration lawyers. Aya stared at it, bewildered. It was a bureaucratic labyrinth she would never have the courage or the knowledge to face alone. "But how? I don't have money for a lawyer," she whispered, her hope colliding with the cruel financial reality. Frau Schmidt looked at her with her clear eyes. "That's none of your business," she said, in her usual direct tone. "You and the boy are my responsibility now." The word responsibility sounded not like a burden, but like an oath. Aya felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back. Crying would seem ungrateful in the face of that silent strength. The following days were a marathon of filling out forms, of phone calls made by Frau Schmidt in her authoritative voice, of visits to a kind, elderly lawyer she knew from her professional past. Aya watched the elderly woman, who had once seemed so frail and closed off, transform into a force of nature, navigating the system with relentless efficiency. It was as if, in finding a case, she had rediscovered her own purpose. Aya helped as much as she could, providing details of her story, signing documents, making sure Youssef wouldn't get in the way. She saw not only her own chance at a future taking shape, but also the rebirth of Frau Schmidt. The forbidden interest had transformed into a mission. The darkness that had hung over the apartment seemed to be dissipating, replaced by the concentrated light of hope and action. Aya could hardly believe that the woman who had once let her in out of pity was now waging a fierce battle for her. It was a gift greater than any shelter or food. It was the gift of a future. The morning of the hearing at the immigration office arrived fraught with electrifying tension. Aya wore the cleanest and most well-preserved clothes she owned, a used gift from Frau Schmidt. The landlady herself was dressed in a stern dark suit, her hair pulled back in an even more rigorous bun than usual. She looked like a warrior about to go into battle. Youssef, sensing the gravity of the moment, remained exceptionally quiet, holding Aya's hand tightly. The train journey to the city center was silent. Aya gazed out the window, watching the city pass by, a tapestry of possibilities that could be denied her at any moment. The government building was imposing and menacing, its cold corridors echoing with the footsteps of uncertain destinies. The lawyer met them at the entrance, greeted Frau Schmidt with evident respect, and led them to a chilly waiting room. The hearing itself was a blur of direct questions, hesitant translations, Frau Schmidt's firm voice intervening to clarify points, to emphasize the persecution Aya had suffered, the real danger of returning. Aya could barely breathe. Everything depended on that. On the decision of a stranger behind a desk. When it was over, they said the decision would come in a few weeks. The return home was grim. The hope Aya had felt withered, replaced by agonizing uncertainty. The days dragged on, each one longer than the last. Aya tried to maintain her routine, but fear was a constant companion. Frau Schmidt, however, seemed strangely confident. She showed no doubt. 2 weeks later, an official letter arrived. It was thick. Frau Schmidt took it from the postman's hands, her face impassive. She took it to the kitchen table, and opened it methodically with a knife. Aya stood on the other side of the room, her heart pounding so hard she feared it would burst from her chest. Frau Schmidt read the letter once, then again. Her thin lips, always pressed into a line of disapproval, softened. They almost curved. She raised her eyes and looked directly at Aya. Her eyes, usually so cold, were gleaming. "Political asylum," she said, her words clear and precise as the tinkling of crystal. "Granted. Temporary residence status for 2 years, with the possibility of renewal." The world stopped for Aya. The air left her lungs in a great sigh. She couldn't process it. She couldn't believe it. Then, reality hit her like a wave. She was saved. She was free. Youssef was free. They could stay. They could live. A sound between laughter and sobs escaped her lips. She fell to her knees on the floor, her whole body trembling with overwhelming relief. Frau Schmidt crossed the room and, for the first time, placed a hand on Aya's shoulder. The touch was awkward, but full of deep emotion. "Everything is all right," the old woman whispered, her voice hoarse. "Everything is all right now." At that moment, in that silent kitchen, the two women wept. One for a future recovered, the other for a past finally, and properly honored. Berlin's harsh winter finally began to give way to the first timid signs of spring. Pale rays of sunshine warmed the park near the apartment, where Aya watched Youssef chase a sparrow, his cries of joy echoing in the cool air. The scene was normal, commonplace, and therefore, profoundly miraculous. Much had changed in the months following the granting of asylum. With the paperwork in order, Frau Schmidt used her connections to get Aya a part-time job at a small municipal library, a quiet and orderly environment where her meticulous skills were valued. It was a humble beginning, but it was a real beginning. She could contribute to expenses, she could buy new clothes for Youssef, she could plan for a future. Frau Schmidt's apartment was no longer a temporary refuge, but a shared home. The dynamic between the two women had become deeply familiar. Aya cooked Tunisian dishes that were now appreciated, not just tolerated. Frau Schmidt taught Aya German with the patience of an experienced teacher, and read stories to Youssef at night, her voice gaining a softness that had previously seemed impossible. The house, once a museum of silence, was now full of life, laughter, and the sounds of a family. One afternoon, Aya arrived home from work and found a small box on her bed. Inside was a key. Frau Schmidt stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, a near smile on her lips. "It's for you," she said. "The attic door. I've turned it into a small apartment. It's simple, but it's yours." For you and Youssef. So you can have your privacy. Aya was speechless. She went down to the attic. The transformation was breathtaking. The space she had cleared, which had once harbored ghosts, was now a welcoming studio. There was a small kitchen, a new bathroom, and the main area served as both bedroom and living room. The late afternoon light streamed through a skylight, illuminating the old wooden crib, the same one she had found on the first day, now restored and painted white, ready for Youssef. It was a gesture of profound respect and love. It wasn't charity. It was an acknowledgement that Aya was a complete person, with the right to her own space, her own life, within this new world they had built together. Aya turned to Frau Schmidt, tears streaming freely down her face. There were no words in any language that could express her gratitude. She simply embraced the older woman tightly. Frau Schmidt, after a moment of hesitation, wrapped her in her thin arms. The embrace was strong, full of all the unspoken words, all the shared pain, all the renewed hope. The Tunisian immigrant who had sought refuge in silence had found not only safety, but a new family. And the German hostess, who had developed a forbidden interest in that silent stranger, rediscovered, in the act of helping, the pieces of her own heart, long lost. Together in that foreign city, they proved that the greatest emotional surprise comes not from grand gestures, but from the silent transformation that occurs when two lonely souls meet and decide, together, to face the world.